International News Edition. His Majesty the King is assured on the armed forces' preparedness to protect the country's security. In an address at the UN Security Council Summit on terrorism threats, the King calls for a coalition of the determined to combat extremist groups with consistency and resolve. And more airstrikes target militants in Iraq, while Syrian Kurdish fighters and militants fight near the Turkish border, sending more refugees fleeing across the border. Good evening and very warm welcome to the news. After returning home from New York, His Majesty the King, the Supreme Commander of the Armed Forces, called on the General Headquarters of the Jordan Armed Forces. King Abdullah was received by the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Mash'al al-Zabin, and His Royal Highness Prince Faisal ibn al-Hussein. The King was assured on the preparations taken by the land, air and naval forces to protect the country's security in the context of the Kingdom's backing of the regional and international coalition against terrorist groups that threaten the security and stability of the region and the world. Jordan, His Majesty vowed, will pursue with all its power and resources in combating and defeating terrorism, drying up their resources and fending off their danger. The Army Chief briefed the King on all operational, logistical and administrative issues of the various units and formations and their plans to deal with threats. The Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff said the armed forces and security forces would remain the shield of the country's land, waters and space, and stood ready to defend the homeland. His Majesty the King and Her Majesty Queen Rania returned home earlier after working visits to New York and Paris. His Majesty addressed the 69th UN General Assembly and participated in the panel session of the 10th annual meeting for the Clinton Global Initiative. The panel addressed a number of regional and international issues and those pertaining to education, women and community empowerment and support for entrepreneurial ideas. On the sidelines of the General Assembly, King Abdullah met with a number of world leaders and heads of delegations, including Egyptian President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, Iraqi President Mohammed Fuad Massoum, as well as UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon. The meetings addressed the overall situation in the Middle East and the challenges posed to the region, especially those related to extremism and terrorism and international and regional efforts to fight it. In France, the first stop on the royal tour, King Abdullah met with French President François Hollande and Prime Minister Manuel Valls. In an address at the UN Security Council Summit on threats to international peace and security caused by terrorist acts, King Abdullah said the sources of extremist support should be shut down to defeat them. His Majesty said a coalition of the determined was needed to combat extremist groups with consistency and resolve. He said leaders in every country and religion must speak out against intolerance and distortions, noting that Jordan took the lead in interfaith initiatives. Here's a recording of the speech.
First, let me thank President Obama for his leadership on this issue, and Jordan can be counted on to play our part. We need to shut down the sources of extremist support and push back and defeat these groups. This demands a coalition of the determined, one that can combat the threat with consistency and resolve. Allow me to salute the partnership that is gearing up. Three principles are important as we proceed. The first is global reach and commitment. The threat is not only in Syria and Iraq, but also in Sinai, Nigeria, Libya, Yemen, Mali, the Horn of Africa, and more. It is not an Arab or Muslim fight anymore. It affects every delegate here and beyond. It is the fight of our times. Success requires a united struggle backed up by strong resources. Success also requires a holistic approach. Transnational terror grows on the back of crises, grievances, and sectarian conflict. Winning hearts and minds requires a strong stand against poverty and exclusion. In parallel with security measures, there must be diplomacy, development, job creation, education, and more. A second key principle is immediate action. The new breed of extremism is recruiting worldwide through social media and covert partnerships. The more resource-rich territory they hold, the more self-perpetuating they become. Time is of the essence. We have started taking action, and the coalition must see this through. The third requirement is transparency. These groups rely for their survival on international transactions and support. Mr. President, there has to be a zero-tolerance policy to any country, organization, or individual that facilitates, supports, or finances terror groups, or provides weapons or promotes propaganda, whether through media outlets or misusing religious clerics, that incites and helps recruit fighters to these terrorist groups. Compliance must also be absolute. Countries cannot comply in one theater while making mischief in another. Senior figures in every religion and country must speak out against intolerance and distortion. I and others have made clear that ISIS and related ideologies are in no way related to Islam, nor should we permit any form of Islamophobia. Jordan has taken a lead in interfaith initiatives, and we are working now on introducing a Security Council resolution that will address the systematic targeting of religious communities. The world must also act as one to help solve global injustices. We cannot underestimate the recruitment power of a sense of exclusion from basic human rights. First and foremost is a just resolution to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. A united global voice is equally vital in supporting an inclusive political solution in Syria. And in Iraq, we are encouraged to see a solid start for an inclusive new government that will fight terrorist efforts to exploit sectarianism. Finally, I hope that there will be a global call to action to support countries like my own at the forefront of the fight. Jordan is a critical linchpin of stability. Our borders stand secure with terror threats on two fronts. And just this week, we foiled yet another terrorist operation against our country. And of course, we remain a major shock absorber for massive refugee flights from Syria. But we are holding up these critical responsibilities under enormous economic pressures. Global support will play a key role in keeping our country resilient and moving forward. Jordan also seeks a renewed push to get promised refugee assistance flowing for all host countries and communities and inside Syria itself. Thank you, Mr. President.
His Majesty the King said Jordan's borders are extremely secure, stressing that the kingdom has retaliated to several contacts over the past several months to those who have come across its borders. In a television interview with presenter of 60 Minutes program, Scott Pelley, which was broadcast on CBS, the King said the difference with the terrorist Daesh group compared to any other organization is that they are self-financing. These are excerpts of the interview.
The difference with ISIS, I think, compared to any other organization is their self-financing. They can produce within a year, in a year cycle, up to almost $1 billion worth of oil derivatives that they're obviously selling at a low price, about $30 a barrel, which means that they can pay a lot of foreign fighters to come into their country. They can buy weapons.
Would $1 billion a year give them a seat at OPEC?
You would imagine if you had that capability, which is, I think, about what they have today is about a third of the production of the United Arab Emirates. You know, in a way, technically, they'd be asking for a seat at OPEC.
Now, according to the King, all countries in the region face a choice.
ISIS, I think, has triggered an understanding that it's time for all of us to make up our minds on the fight of good against evil. And this brings all of us together from all religions, of all different sides of the divide, to make up our minds, are we going to fight the good fight?
Could the rise of ISIS have been prevented?
They could have been prevented if the international community worked harder together to make sure that funding and support to the original groups in Syria were not allowed to get to the extent that they were.
The international community, the United States, intervened too late.
I think we could have done a better job in making sure that earlier on it was identified who the bad people were, and action by the international community was taken not to allow that to happen.
What are the risks of ISIS if it carries on the way it has?
ISIS, the reaction to ISIS has got to be quick, and we have not been quick. I'm very, very pleased that President Obama has been thinking this through, I think, in a very sensible manner.
But in your estimation, just in the nick of time?
In the nick of time, but the problem is with ISIS is they're cross-border. It's in Syria and Iraq. So it's been a bit difficult, I think, for Western countries. And how do you deal with solving the Iraq part of the puzzle, but then going into eastern Syria, which has some legal ramifications? And I think that's taken a bit of time.
And also in New York, Her Majesty Queen Rania met with a group of social and humanitarian activists representing various civil society institutions as well as the private sector. At a lunch hosted by Jordan River Foundation USA board member Pat Mitchell and the President and CEO of the United Nations Foundation, Kathy Calvin, in New York, Queen Rania and attendees discussed the challenges that Jordan faces, especially in light of the influx of Syrian refugees into the kingdom. The Queen pointed out that although Jordan depends on imports for over 95% of its energy and grain needs, and is considered one of the world's poorest countries in water resources, it is the world's third largest refugee host. The Queen also shed light on the need to invest in education, the healthcare sector, renewable energy and job creation. Also, Queen Rania took part in a Clinton Global Initiative CNN broadcast session titled The 10th Meeting, Turning Ideas into Action. Back here at home, Prime Minister Abdullah Mansour led a meeting of the Economic Development Committee to discuss the Social Security Investment Fund's report and strategic plan for the coming years. The meeting also dealt with the strategic plans and investment aspects as well as mechanisms needed to achieve the fund's objectives. And Mansour stressed the importance of the independence of the fund's decisions on investment to achieve its goals and to contribute to economic development. The Prime Minister also chaired a meeting of the Higher Steering Committee on Refugees Affairs to follow up on the condition of Syrian refugees in the kingdom. The meeting was attended by President of the Jordan Hashemite Charity Organization Board of Trustees, His Royal Highness Prince Rashid Ibn al-Hassan, ministers and directors of concerned agencies. The panel was briefed on the burdens Jordan shoulders as a result of hosting a large number of refugees. Director of Syrian Refugee Camps Affairs, Brigadier General Waddah Al-Hamoud, said 618,000 Syrian refugees are registered with the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, the UNHCR. He said a further 750,000 Syrians were living in the kingdom before the crisis began, more than 3 years ago. The Ministers of Housing and Water also briefed the panel on the services provided to the refugees. And separately, Prime Minister Abdullah Mansour said Jordan is interested in forging closer ties with Cyprus as an important partner and neighbour. He spoke at a meeting with a Cypriot delegation led by Parliament Speaker Yanakis Omiro, during which he gave a briefing on the reforms Jordan had carried out over the past 3 years to boost the democratic process. He said the kingdom had pressed ahead with reforms to enhance democracy and citizens' participation in decision-making despite turbulence in the region. The Prime Minister said the Middle East had not enjoyed peace for a century as it witnessed wars and instability due to the failure to find a just solution to the Palestinian issue. The Cypriot Parliament Speaker said his country is interested in enhanced cooperation with Jordan in the energy field. The Civil Defense Department announced it is installing a system of outdoor sirens at a number of locations in the capital Amman. The siren system, which will be installed in other governorates at a later phase, will broadcast advisory messages to citizens, particularly in emergencies and severe weather conditions. The department said installing the sirens comes in line with upgrading its strategic plan to provide citizens with better awareness services. Now, in other news, new airstrikes were carried out against targets of the militant Daesh group in Iraq. U.S. President Barack Obama said the U.S. would work with a broad coalition to dismantle the militant groups. Britain and Germany are preparing to join the fight against Daesh in Iraq, while France struck targets today. This report has more.
At the request of the Iraqi government, Britain is preparing to join the fight against Daesh militants. British lawmakers are expected to vote tomorrow on whether to participate in US-led airstrikes on targets in Iraq. British Prime Minister David Cameron said he's confident of parliamentary support.
Well, I am convinced that ISIL is a direct threat to Britain. There is now a comprehensive strategy in place to defeat them. I have been asked by the Iraqi government for our help, and so I'll be recalling the British Parliament on Friday so that Britain can take part in international airstrikes against ISIL in Iraq.
The US is at the forefront of the fight against Daesh and is now pounding the militants' positions in Syria. France said its fighter jets struck targets in Iraq. The strikes were the first since Paris joined the United States military action against the militants in Iraq. France last week became the first foreign government to join the United States by conducting airstrikes in Iraq. German Defense Minister arrived on an unannounced visit to the Kurdish city of Erbil in northern Iraq. On her agenda were meetings with German soldiers and talks with Kurdish President Masoud Barzani, as well as the visit of refugee camps in the region. Weapons and military advisors from Germany are expected to arrive in Erbil within the next few days. The international community is providing weapons and military assistance to Kurdish fighters in order to help them fight militants. Hala Debabne for the news at 10.
Syrian Kurdish fighters engaged militants in a fierce battle near Kobani on the border with Turkey, leaving several fighters on both sides dead. The militants intensified their advance despite US-led airstrikes and on their positions elsewhere. The fighting has forced tens of thousands of mostly Kurdish Syrians to flee for their lives. As the fighting intensified, more Syrian Kurds crossed into Turkey. More than 100,000 Kurds fled the town and surrounding villages, crossing over the nearby border into Turkey. A third night of US-led airstrikes late last night targeted militant-controlled oil refineries in eastern Syria. The Syrian Observatory for Human Rights said 8 fighters had been killed in overnight clashes. A unity government is to take control of the Gaza Strip after a breakthrough in talks between Palestinian factions. The agreement could strengthen the Palestinians' negotiating hand in talks with Israel next month. The Gaza ceasefire struck in August between Israel and the Palestinians called for the Palestinian Authority to take over civil administration in Gaza from Hamas. Officials from Hamas and Abbas's Fatah movement announced the deal today in Cairo, where they had been meeting under the auspices of Egypt's intelligence services. The factions agreed to the makeup of a national unity government in May. But a dispute over the Palestinian Authority's non-payment of salaries to Gaza's public sector workers later brought relations close to breaking point. We begin with the Bundesliga. Borussia Dortmund staged a late comeback from 2 goals down to draw 2-2 with Stuttgart. Stuttgart looked to be cruising to their first win of the campaign when Daniel Didavi struck twice early in the second half for a 2-goal cushion. But goals from Pierre-Emerick in the 73rd and Ciro Immobile in the 86th minute helped avoid what would have been Dortmund's 3rd loss in 5 games. The draw leaves Dortmund on 7 points, 4 behind leaders Bayern Munich, while Stuttgart moved off the bottom spot. Also in the Bundesliga, Bayer Leverkusen bounced back from last week's 4-1 loss to Wolfsburg to edge past Augsburg 1-0 and move up to 2nd place on 10 points. To South Korea and the Asian Games, Taiwanese weightlifter Lin Soo-chi, who set 2 world records at the Incheon Asian Games, said her strong opponents had pushed her hard. Lin set world records in the clean and jerk and overall lift on her way to winning weightlifting gold in the 63-kilogram category in the competitions today. Now let's have a look at the weather forecast. Cool tonight in most regions with northwesterly light to fresh winds. There will be a slight drop in temperatures tomorrow, so it will be fair across much of the highlands and mild in the eastern plains. Winds will be northwesterly brisk, blowing dust in the desert areas. The Jordan Valley should expect a hot day tomorrow, with the high slightly crossing the 36-degree mark at the Dead Sea. Hot weather is also forecast for Aqaba, with northerly brisk winds and choppy seas. Next are the lows and highs for tonight and tomorrow. And before we close, Jordan will go on holiday in observance of Eid al-Adha, Feast of Sacrifice, starting Friday, October the 3rd, through Tuesday, October the 7th. A statement by the Prime Minister's office said all ministries and public offices will be closed during that period. Now, our top stories once again. His Majesty the King is assured on the armed forces' preparedness to protect the country's security. In an address at the UN Security Council Summit on Terrorism Threats, the King calls for a coalition of the determined to combat extremist groups with consistency and resolve. And more airstrikes target militants in Iraq, while Syrian Kurdish fighters and militants fight near the border with Turkey, sending more refugees fleeing across the border. And that's the end of tonight's news. My name is Raad Btoush. Thank you so much for your company.